Welcome to Data Science Perspectives. This series focuses on analytics and data science professionals from across industry to learn about how their career unfolded, what skills they look for when hiring, and what trends they think are coming next. I'm your host, Bill Franks. Let's get to it. Welcome to this episode of Data Science Perspectives. I'm your host, Bill Franks. Today I'm going to be joined by Doug Hague. I first met Doug more than 10 years ago when he was at Bank of America and I was at Teradata. We both ended up at the same event a couple of times, chatted, and I found his perspectives to be valuable ever since. It's also fantastic that he's another person I know who made the jump from the business world to academia like I did, although he did beat me by a few years. Doug's currently the Executive Director of Corporate Engagement at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. He first joined UNCC in 2018, and over his time there, he helped to establish the School of Data Science and also served as its first executive director. Prior to that, Doug had spent many years at Bank of America in various roles, including his final role as the Chief Analytics Officer for Bank of America Merchant Services. He also had some early roles at both Sprint and United Technologies. He has a bachelor's in engineering physics from University of Tulsa, a master's in system design and management from MIT, and then a master's in metal science and engineering, as well as a PhD in materials science from Penn State. And with that, let's welcome Doug to the show. Thanks for joining me on the show today, Doug.
Hey, it's great to be here, Bill.
So the question I always want to start everybody off with is just to learn, what is it that initially drew you years ago into the world of analytics and data science?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because years ago, there wasn't a field of analytics and data science. So as I started my career, I was a material scientist, got my PhD in material science, went to work. As time went on, I had many different roles. And what I found I was good at and what the companies wanted me to do was put together kind of long-term forecast, strategy type work with logic and data and math. Now that's called data science. So I started really with that at Pratt & Whitney doing jet engines and analysis on failures. Started that at Sprint as well, but really looking at the internet architecture and how their infrastructure was going to evolve over a long time. It turned into what was called a field of real options. That ended up having me move to Bank of America, where I really started to do what's now termed analytics and data science. It was really within banking that I started to have the name of an analytics person or a data science person as I was building teams and really trying to solve business problems with mathematics and the data that was around. And eventually that became known as data science.
It's interesting. I know a lot of people of our generation kind of backdoored into the field like you did, where you had an adjacent degree of some type because there weren't analytics degrees. I wonder, how many people today would backdoor into it? I don't know, only because there's so many degrees and programs now that if you were interested, you probably would have learned about it and pursued it. Though you were at a corporation, I'd say I still wouldn't have a problem if someone came out of an adjacent degree into one of my teams if they were eager to do it.
Yeah, we still, until recently, well, when I was in the last part of the bank, we still hired economists, engineers, physicists, any type of science that you really had to do coding and were exposed to a lot of data. And then I think there's now over 300 master's programs in data science and analytics across the country. And so we eventually started, hiring out of those degrees. But to your point, there really wasn't. And even now, if you look at a bachelor's program, there's very few, data science programs across the country. We have one here at UNC Charlotte, but that's, we're one of like 50 bachelor's degrees in that. There are more business analytics, which is a little bit more business focused and less coding.
Yeah, we're another one of the 50, by the way. Here, we just
Yeah, I know
we've
you
got a
are.
bachelor's now. Yeah, that's our newest. But yeah, it's interesting too because as you mentioned, you started out more on the engineering side in some of the more, let's say, manufacturing based companies. You ended up then at Bank of America and really stayed with finance for a while. What was it about the finance and banking industry that kind of got your attention and then kept it for so long?
Yeah, it was one of, I had never really thought about finance. One of my classmates, a cohort that I was in at one of my universities, called up and he had moved to banking, and it's like, would you ever consider? And I was like, why would I want to be a banker? But I came and interviewed, and they had really interesting problems. The amount of data that was available and the problems that you could solve and make an impact. It was really what drew me to banking. And then I stayed because I kept having new jobs, right? When I was there, we often change jobs every year to 2 years, which seems really fast, and it is. But I got to see a lot of the company, and what I became good at, or what they kept asking me to do, is to go into areas where there was lots of data, but no one really utilizing it yet. And so to start to organize it, to get the reporting done, to move into predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics and data science, that was my job, was to organize everything to be able to take advantage of the data. And then they would move me to the next place that had, lots of data and no answers. And that's what I did for, 2 or 3 different jobs at Bank of America, was move to these teams. And that's one of the things about finance. It's so broad that there's lots of different levels of maturity. Like the trading floors, everybody talks about the markets and the trading floors and algorithmic trading. That's very, very advanced. But there are areas that are less advanced that I kept being asked to help go sort out.
That comment about different levels of maturity is so true. In my consulting days, there'd be companies that were world renowned for one type of thing, whether it was marketing or supply chain operations. And then if you went in and started digging into their analytic processes, they might have world-class stuff on that area they were known well for and have been completely deficient in some of the other areas that other companies did. Now, I think that's balanced a little more today. But I think part of that was in those early days of analytics, companies really, they'd focus on one area. They didn't have a ton of resources and they put it in some of their strategic areas versus today where they've got analytics capabilities spread out. Does that kind of match with what you were seeing?
Yeah, especially for the very largest companies, I would say that's true. I still think there are some areas that either they're scared of or would rather not take the risk profile in. For example, HR. There are a lot of companies that won't put analytics into HR just because there's so many ways to have bias, and it's easier to defend if you have a human there, for better or worse, than if you have a machine that's doing it at scale. So there are areas still in the large companies, but what I'm seeing now is the breadth of companies that are actually applying data science and analytics. So even nonprofits and smaller companies are beginning to try and utilize this skill set. And so the breadth of opportunities is still increasing quite a bit. It's not just finance and technology and the largest companies anymore. It's really almost any company out there that's taking advantage of this, especially as the bachelor's degree programs come on, where the cost is a little bit lower than what may have been historically the rate for a data scientist.
By the way, you mentioned how many degrees there are now. I still remember, I think it was only around 2011 or 12, the first time I had a slide I would talk to clients about how there are now actually degrees in what was then called typically, business analytics, and so forth. And there was a handful. Like I remember the first time it crossed 10 and there was debate. Oh, is this really going to take off? Is this going to stick? I'd say, a decade and a couple hundred programs later, I believe that it's stuck.
Yeah, and I do have to give a lot of credit to Michael Rapa out of NC State. He was one of those first, if not the first, analytics program. And he really has been tracking that over time and has led the way for many of us. But of course, I've got a great program here and you've got a great program there. But I do got to give Michael a call out there.
Well, speaking of academics, then, the one thing that's interesting where our backgrounds ended up paralleling a little bit is you also flipped out from many years in industry and then went over to the university. So kind of what led you to make that change? And then what have you learned since then that's helped shape, your view of analytics, from both the academic and the business angles?
Yeah, a couple things. One, and I'll go back to where I was talking about my first major job change, right? When I was changing from a research scientist to a manufacturing floor. My mentor had said, why do you want to make that? Nobody that's got a PhD goes onto the manufacturing floor and works a 365, 24/7, shop. And so he had me write and read Stephen Covey's 7 Habits for Highly Effective People. I'm
Yeah.
sure you're aware of it, maybe not so aware
Yeah.
anymore, but in there's a life plan. What do you value and what do you want to do with your life? In that plan that I wrote, in 1993 or something like that, I had said I always wanted to go back to a university. The end of my career, when I was done with my corporate career, I wanted to go back to a university to be the professor that I had when I was at a university that came from industry. Because I always felt I received a lot more value on how it actually worked in industry than some, not all, but some of the professors that were more theoretical and didn't fully understand how it's applied. I'm always an applied person. And so I always wanted to come back to university to give that back. And so I did. And what I learned, second part of your question, what I learned when I'm back is patience, number one, at a university. Universities are consensus building, slower to make decisions than many corporations. And it's not always about, an ROI, although many times it is. It's not fully about that. But the other thing that you find out is that it's consistent. People behave as they are incented, right? You always think about big bonuses and all of that when you're in finance and services and how people were incented, but it's also true in the university, but they're just incented in very different ways. Your tenure process, your renewal, your papers, your research funding, they're incented in very different ways than you are in a corporation. And what I've told people is when I was an equivalent of a department chair, there were, lots of faculty that worked for me that were essentially independent consultants that we were trying to find a common vision for. But they had a lot of autonomy in their own work. And that was a different way to manage versus here's the CEO's strategy and we're all going to align to the strategy.
I tell you, you hit on a key thing I found is a big difference in university as well, especially large corporate organizations. But for the most part, even smaller ones, there is a hierarchy. And if the boss says we got to go this direction, you're going to have to go that direction. Now, you could always leave the company, right? You might argue, but you're going to either have to do it or you might get fired. Whereas at the university, a lot of times, especially tenured professors, they can pretty much just say, no, I don't think I want to do that. And there's not necessarily a mechanism to force them to do that, depending on what it is that you're asking them to do,
Well,
which surprised me because
there's no force. There's no forcing.
Yes.
There's influencing, and there's
Yes.
discussion and debate, and there's much more discussion and debate and influencing and working. The tenure process. I'll not knock the tenure process. It's got its uses and its purpose, and it helps protect the freedom of speech and academic freedom. And so that's a good thing. But there are other things that you have to work through and debate and influence people. And you're right, it's much more of an influence. And if they don't want to go the direction that you want to, then they have that freedom to do that.
Well, that's where it comes together, I guess, having some experience managing larger teams and having to have, you always have to have some influence. You're not going to be effective even if you have the official power. So my guess is that's part of what helped you be successful in navigating, getting the school set up and everything at UNCC was that you were comfortable with having to make yourself influential as well as having the official.
That was the thing, especially in data science, right? Data science. When I was a chief analytics officer, I was a service organization, so I served the rest of the corporation, right? And so I had a boss, but I also had, I was matrixed to 15 other people. Universities don't understand that kind of matrix. I was able to influence, and the data science in particular, the interdisciplinary nature, right? You really have to be able to talk to everyone across the university or across many different fields, such that because data science is everywhere now, and being able to influence and understand and understand their perspectives and there's different, talking to a philosophy professor is much different than talking to a CS professor or an electrical engineer or even a historian. And each of their incentive structures and their philosophy on what is good and what their results should be and how they influence the world, they're all different. And you need to understand that to be able to work. But working in that kind of shared matrix environment of an analytics team helped me really understand how to do that.
Well, that's a good segue. One thing I'd be curious about, you've obviously had a long career and you've managed to have success in a couple of uh, different environments. What's one or two traits that you have that you would credit with an outsized influence on that success over the years?
Yeah, there's really two, as I thought about that question, two things. One is an insatiable curiosity, right? I am just curious about other people, other work, want to find out what makes them tick, what makes their work logical. I'm a very logical person. Sometimes logic doesn't work, by the way. There are fields where logic is not the best strength to have, but it's often common. And so the curiosity about other people and their work and is one of those things that has served me very well, whether it's in industry or whether that's in a university, and understanding and be able to talk to many different people without judgment is one of those things that's very important. And to go along with that is really the willingness to listen, right? I try and listen first. I'm not always successful at that. You can talk to my teams. I do talk sometimes, um, but I always try and listen to their perspective and incorporate that in. And there's one other thing that I would say is, as I've managed lots of people over my career, one of the things that I did, and I think is not as common as I would have thought, is willing to take feedback, internalize it, and actually change. Right? Everybody kind of laughs at annual reviews sometimes. Here's the feedback, here's your performance, or you get a coach and they're giving you feedback, or you have one of your peers saying, "Hey, maybe that's not," and you get offended, or you say, "Hey, well, they really don't know what they're talking about," but really they all have valid perspectives. Being able to internalize that and understand that you need to change and always listen and then take action on it is something that I've always felt was very important. The feedback from my team on the 360s or whatever you want to call their feedback to you was always the most important feedback to me. The student evaluations of learning is what it is here at a university, right? They write their feedback. And look, some of it's junk, right? They just criticize you. They're mad the day they fill it out. It's all right. But there are always very good comments that I've changed the way I teach, the way I interact in the classroom because of those student comments. And so they're always very valuable, and continuing to evolve is one of those things. I had an early sensei. Every error is a gem. Every mistake is a gem, right? And so take those gems when you get them and don't say, I messed up. It's like, oh, what can I learn from that mistake, from that issue, from that gem that you've just been given, to be able to learn and grow from it. And so I take that very seriously.
Well, maybe we can, after we're done here today, maybe we can set up another call where I can unload to you all the problems I have with you over the years. But that's a topic for another
That's
day.
great. That would be great.
Yeah. So, it's interesting as well. You and I were some of the first chief analytics officers that were out there, right? They only those roles, shockingly, really have only been around barely ten years now.
10
So,
years.
you were one of the earliest ones. What have you seen in terms of how CAO and now also chief data officers are all kind of intertwined? These executive leadership roles around analytics and data have evolved. What do you think is different today than when we first were in it a decade ago?
Yeah, it was when we first were trying. I remember calling you saying you got a job description for a chief analytics officer, because there weren't any, right? You were Googling it, and I had to write and describe what a chief analytics officer did as I was going into the role. And so that was very interesting. And one of the things you already mentioned that has what evolved is there were chief data officers and there were chief analytics officers, and those roles have sometimes blended together. Often they have blended together. I keep thinking they're very distinct roles, although they can be blended together because it all has to do with data and they rely on each other. But having a chief data and analytics officer versus a chief analytics officer or a chief data officer, right? One's a little bit more IT, one's a little bit more business. And so I think the blended role is really kind of the evolution of what we had. I also thought, when I first launched this, that there would be a lot of CAOs, CDAOs in the C suite. That really hasn't happened. There are a few, but they're often reporting to somebody that's in the C suite, even though they have a chief in their name.
Right.
They haven't got to the most senior levels of the corporations that I would have thought they would have. But they're still early, right? It's only been a job for 10 years. How it will evolve, what it will evolve to, um, we'll see. And
It's
what the,
interesting. I
what the
call it
AI
little.
is going to do to us, right? The word AI and the evolution of AI is going to have an influence here.
I call it the little CC jobs. And the chief
Yeah.
analytics officer is not the only one. A lot of times CTOs, like chief information security officers, there's these roles that
Yeah.
are considered important enough to get a C, but they still want to keep the official C-suite down to that 6 or 8 people, like, operations, sales, finance, etc. Um, I'll say I'm happy as an industry that we went from no representation, much above manager, maybe director 20 years ago, to having little C's a lot of places. It's one of those
Yeah.
things where I think there's a half full look to that.
There is.
That's a lot better way to look at it than half empty. Because to your point, it's only been 10 years, and there's still plenty of time to evolve.
Yeah, yeah, and it's going to be an interesting watching it evolve, especially with the hype cycle of AI and where are we, and are we through the trough of disillusionment yet, or the AI winter, and now where are we and how that evolves, and what's the relationship between AI and data science and analytics is one of those debate points that is actually interesting.
Well, what at this point, obviously, over time, as you mentioned, you've switched roles many times, even internally in the company, focusing on different things, and that would energize you, keep you interested, keep you learning. So today, when you wake up, you look at your calendar and you see a day's full of various meetings and activities. What motivates you most? What's on the calendar on a day that you say, man, this is a good day to do what I'm doing?
Yeah, and I'll just take the best. The best days are when I'm working with students, right? I don't, depending upon the day, some days I'll be working a lot with students, and some days I'll be doing more administrative tasks or interacting with corporations to let them interact with students. But the best days right now are when you're interacting with students and helping them learn and grow with their career as they start out, right? Because they're still got a lot of questions and choices to make in their careers, and giving back to them and helping them learn along the way is really what makes a great day.
What about, speaking of students? What advice would you give to? And I guess in your role, you probably still do give on a frequent basis. Like, what's some of your top advice for students if they're starting their career and they're looking to get into this world of data science, analytics, and now AI as it exists today?
Yeah. Well, we're in Charlotte, right? I'm based in Charlotte, which is a large banking finance town, and everybody wants to be in finance. It seems like anybody that's in data science wants to be in finance, and that's a good thing, right? Finance has great opportunities and jobs, and what I tell them is be open to other experiences, right? I changed industries 3 times or 4 times now. Being able to do that and use the data is be open to opportunities as they come, and don't be afraid to step in, right? And lean in and take something and get the experience, and then decide if it's for you and continue on your career, because there are going to be lots of times where you're making choices that you can change directions. Some of our students lock in to say, I want to do this, and they're not really looking broadly and widely and open to opportunities. I got a lot of my opportunities from pulling. It used to be the little tear sheets that you would pull a phone number off of, or an email that was on a bulletin board at a university. I applied to a lot of those things. I got into different national labs. I had a lot of opportunities because I was willing to apply and try something that was not necessarily in my comfort zone. And that's what I tell them a lot of times. I took jobs in my career where I had no idea how to do the job, right? But I had a confidence in myself that I could learn quickly enough and then do the job well. So don't be afraid to jump in, even if you don't think you're, fully capable at that time. You will get there.
It's interesting. A couple weeks back, I was having a discussion with a friend of mine who's about our age, right? Venting about this consulting role they have now, and they said, they hired me to do X, and that's what I know how to do really well. And then they asked me to help on this project with Y, and now they keep throwing me on things with Y, and now Z's coming in. And this is the first time in my career I feel like in over my head, and I don't really know some of this stuff, and that they keep giving it to me. And so they were thinking it was a bad thing. I said, well, not that it isn't frustrating, but I'm going to give you a different perspective because I've been there running consulting teams. I said, they might be giving this to you for the whole opposite reason. In other words, instead of them thinking that you're in over your head, they're giving it to you because they know you're going to figure it out, and you've figured it out a few times, and you're probably in the tremendously high level of graces of some of your management while you're sitting here frustrated for that exact reason. You may be frustrated, but they know you're figuring it out, and other people wouldn't. And so I think I cheered them up a little bit that day because they said, I hadn't thought of it
Yeah.
that way, right? They were thinking that they were getting hurt or put down by the manager. Like, no, I think this is an honor
No,
that you
that's
keep getting put
the
on this.
people that you can rely on and throw in any situation are the ones you want to keep around and promote and do, continue to develop their career. And that's what I ended up. And it didn't matter where I was. I would just jump in and do what was asked. Everything from cleaning underneath big manufacturing machines to doing the latest data science and modeling different things. I would do whatever was asked and trying to do it to the best of my ability. And that was successful. I was very fortunate.
And that ties to your advice to students, I guess, to wrap this back up. Yeah, if you can be somebody who folks know they'll get it done, whatever it is, they'll find a way, whether they get help or not, right? That's where you want to be in a career because that's who people want around. So
Yeah,
let's
absolutely.
finish up because I know you give me a lot of time already. Just one last thought from you in terms of as you look at where we are today, next 3 to 5 years, what do you think one or two of the big trends is going to be that we're going to see unfold?
So what I keep thinking, and this is really around the generative AI space, is the tools to help automate some of the coding and some of our other jobs that we have that took skill that we train people on. They're not necessarily going to be as necessary anymore. But what is really the critical thinking. So as we talk about what do we want to train students for in the next 5 years, but also in the next 10 and 15, and what's the most usable skill? It's really critical thinking, right? So it's not necessarily how to code Python because, right, you just tell the Gen AI here's the structure and the logic, and please code this in Python or C or whatever, and it'll do it. So the specifics of a language and syntax are less important, but how to organize and understand, algorithmic progression, how things are calculated, how things are worked, where the problems are, where the risks are, right? Model risk is one of those areas I've been jumping into is what can go wrong with a model or with an algorithm and where and how you do that. So I think in the next 5 years, it's really the critical analysis and thinking to be able to structure the architecture of things and then thinking back on how can it break so that we can actually proactively fix those breaks before they happen, or how to make things fair. I mean, fairness is going to be a huge issue.
Great. I can't argue with anything you just said. I love your point on the logic flow. I think that's terrific. So a great way to end. I just want to thank you for taking the time to join me today. And as always, it's a pleasure speaking with you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, Bill, thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it.